When people think about space medicine, they usually imagine astronauts floating in microgravity on the ISS. But some of the most important medical research for future space missions isn't happening in space at all. It's happening in the deserts, underwater habitats, Arctic stations, and sealed simulations labs here on Earth. These are called analog space missions. And today I want to walk you through what kind of medical research can actually be done in these environments, how those studies are designed, and what their limitations are. I was recently on an analog mission at the Mars Desert Research Station as a crew medic, and these were some of the research I was involved in. I'll outline that in a separate video, but I really wanted to cover what analog missions are useful for, because that was the most common question that I received. So, what are analog space missions? Analog missions are environments designed to simulate key aspects of spaceflight. Things like isolation, confinement, limited resources, delayed communication, and long mission duration. Think of places like the Mars desert habitats, underwater labs like NEMO, or Antarctic research stations where some MD researchers spend a year at a time doing dedicated research. And there's windows where you can't even leave the Antarctic. I think there's only the summer window, which is maybe a few months. So they're really isolated environments. They don't perfectly replicate space, and that matters, but they are incredibly powerful for studying how humans adapt when autonomy increases and support disappears. So the first avenue of research that's really important is physiological medical research. Now, physiology is very fundamental, and how that changes with space, microgravity, and eventually different planets that we get to is crucial to understand. One major area of research is to understand how the body adapts to prolonged confinement and stress. For example, researchers study cardiovascular changes by tracking heart rate variability, blood pressure, and orthostatic tolerance throughout a mission. Crew members are monitored before the mission, repeatedly and daily throughout, and then again afterward. During my mission with the MDRS, we had a smartwatch that measured our heart rate variability, our sleep quality daily. And so that was a fundamental part of our research. Even without microgravity, these analog missions can reveal something important, which that a lot of the physiological decline that happens isn't just about the gravity. It's about sleep disruption. It's about chronic stress, reduced activity, and altered routines. It can help us understand these changes without the element of microgravity. Immune function is a second big area for physiological studies. Studies collect blood or saliva samples at regular intervals to look at inflammatory markers, immune suppression, and even reactivation of latent viruses, such as herpes. And this has been noted in previous astronaut missions. What we see is that isolation and psychological stress alone can measurably alter immune health. And it's important to measure this before actually sending someone on deeper space missions to Mars and beyond. The second area of research is cognitive and psychological research, and this probably amounts to the largest research contributed by analog missions. And this is where they really shine. Researchers look at how cognition changes over time, things like attention, reaction time, memory, and decision making. One of the key hypotheses for the mission that I was part of was looking at how isolated and confined environments can change decision making for crew members, especially when faced with conflicting information. So crew members often complete short cognitive tasks weekly or even daily. Over long missions, subtle patterns can be found. Slower reaction times, increased variability, cognitive fatigue, especially towards later stage of the mission. And it's important to analyze and quantify this beforehand. So psychological health is studied in parallel to physiological health. So researchers can also track things like mood, anxiety, depressive symptoms, sleep quality, and stress coping styles. This is done usually through a mix of standardized questionnaires, which actually we were doing pretty regularly during our analog mission, and qualitative reviews or journaling can also be a part of these. But here's the key point. The stress in an analog mission isn't just simulated, it actually feels real. People miss their families, we get frustrated with our crewmates that we feel trapped in. This could be good or a bad thing, but again, this is what's being studied, and this is why this data is actually so valuable. The third area of research is team dynamics and medical decision making. Another critical research area is how small teams function under pressure, especially when medical events or medical emergencies occur. In many analog missions, medical scenarios are deliberately introduced. Things like simulated abdominal emergencies, traumas, infection. Researchers then observe how the crew responds. How fast do they recognize the problem? How do they communicate? Whose orders do they follow? Is the hierarchy still maintained? Do they follow the protocols or do they improvise? Where do the errors occur in cognition and execution? So this is particularly important because future space crews won't have immediate access to specialists. If you're on Mars and you want to call back to ground mission control, that's going to be 20 to 40 minutes of time that's going to be spent seeking medical advice. device. So the time is going to be a very crucial aspect, and you don't have experts readily available. So medical decisions will need to be made, whether it's by non-physicians, under stress, and with incomplete information. So analog missions are important because they can expose where these protocols break in the real world and not just on paper, so you can test these protocols out. The fourth area this leads into is the creation of autonomous and AI-supported medical care. This is probably the leading edge of research that's happening for analog missions and for longer-term human spaceflight. One of the forward-looking areas is autonomous medical care without human in the loop. A lot of research right now focuses on human and clinician in the loop medical decision-making, but if you're 40 minutes away from the closest human that's a medical expert, you're going to need to have autonomous systems in place that can make some level of medical decision. So some studies are now comparing decision support tools like traditional manuals and traditional textbooks versus AI-based guidance to see how well non-medical crew members can manage medical problems. Researchers measure output and quality markers like diagnostic accuracy, time to treatment, confidence levels, error rates, and outcomes. But just as importantly, the study also focused on psychological burden of being responsible for someone else's health when help is far away, particularly if you haven't trained to be a doctor and take on the responsibility of someone's health. The emotional weight is something you cannot study in a lab, and only environments like analog missions can help you quantify that in a certain way. The fifth area of research is medical systems and logistics. So analog missions are used to test entire medical systems, not just individuals. Researchers ask questions like, what medical supplies get used? What medications degrade over time? What equipment is actually never touched or useful for the crew members? Where do the training gaps appear, and how can we address them? So over weeks or months, small inefficiencies can compound. And this is where analog missions are really helpful, because you can identify this on the ground before sending the crew leaves Earth. So now, how are these studies designed? Most analog medical research doesn't actually use classical randomized control trials, which is the golden standard for a lot of medical research. However, what the researchers rely on are longitudinal studies where each participant serves as their own control. Repeated measure designs, mixed method research, usually combining data and interviews. Both qualitative and quantitative methods are combined, and a lot of these are cohort-based observational studies. These designs prioritize realism and feasibility over perfect experimental control, because in space, realism matters more than having the perfect research design. Some limitations for analog mission research, and these are very important to note, is that they are really helpful for certain aspects, but certain questions the analog missions won't help you answer. They don't replicate microgravity or space radiation. Sample sizes are small, and participants are usually highly motivated and psychologically resilient, so there's a little bit of a selection bias there. This doesn't mean that analog research won't be hypothesis generating. It most often is, but it's not going to give you the definitive answer that you need. So analog research, most of it will be hypothesis generating and sometimes confirmation of different tools and protocols in place. But this research is actually still very important, and it matters quite a lot. Analog missions help us answer questions that traditional medicine typically avoids. What happens when evacuation isn't an option? What happens when you can't send them to a tertiary quaternary center for higher level care? What happens when expertise is delayed? What happens when systems slowly degrade instead of failing all at once? These insights don't prepare us for Mars, they prepare us for remote medicine, disaster response, military medicine, future AI-driven healthcare on Earth, and a lot of different broader applicabilities. As a doctor on an analog mission, conducting some of the medical research, it was very important for me to see how the lack of having a safety net and a background of accessibility to expertise can actually be really game-changing and practice-changing for how you think through problems. And so for me as a clinician, that was very important insight that I gained from this experience. So analog missions overall, I think, are an extremely useful way to study medical research before sending patients and astronauts into longer spaceflight. And so these analog missions are not just about pretending that we're on Mars or on the moon. They're about understanding what happens to human health when certainty disappears and autonomy becomes unavoidable. And in that sense, they may be some of the most important medical laboratories that we have here on Earth. In the next video, I'll outline the actual medical research I partook in this analog mission at the Mars Desert Research Station, some of the equipment involved, some of the research questions we were answering, because I thought it was actually very interesting to be a subject in this medical research after having done years of actual medical research myself. So stay tuned for the next video. Thank you.